Picture this: a worn-down gas station on the outskirts of nowhere, where a four-star general stops for fuel during a cross-country drive. Behind the counter stands a quiet man in his 60s, weathered hands moving efficiently as he processes the payment. The general notices something: a faded tattoo, a particular way the man carries himself, the sharp attention in his eyes despite his humble surroundings. When their eyes meet, there's a moment of recognition that will change everything. What happens next will leave you speechless and remind you that heroes often hide in plain sight, wearing the most unexpected uniforms. The desert highway stretched endlessly under the blazing Arizona sun as General Marcus Thompson's black SUV hummed along the asphalt. 4 stars gleamed on his uniform collar, a testament to decades of distinguished service that had taken him from the muddy trenches of Afghanistan to the marble halls of the Pentagon. Today, however, he wasn't rushing to another briefing or strategic meeting. This was personal time, a rare luxury he'd granted himself during a cross-country drive to visit his aging father in California. The fuel gauge needle hovered dangerously close to empty, and Thompson felt a familiar knot of concern in his stomach. Out here, gas stations were as scarce as rain in the desert. Just as he began calculating whether he had enough fuel to reach the next major town, a weathered sign appeared on the horizon: Pete's Gas and Go, last stop for 50 miles. The small station materialized like a mirage, its faded paint and rusty pumps telling stories of countless travelers who'd found salvation in this unlikely oasis. Thompson pulled up to pump number 2, the only one that looked remotely functional. As he stepped out of his air-conditioned vehicle, the desert heat hit him like a physical wall. He'd experienced scorching temperatures in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the dry Arizona heat still commanded respect. The station was a relic from another era. No fancy digital displays or card readers at the pumps. A handwritten sign directed customers to pay inside first. Thompson couldn't help but smile at the old-school approach. In a world of increasing automation, there was something refreshingly human about this place. The bell above the door chimed as Thompson entered the small store. Behind the counter stood a man in his early 60s, salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed despite his humble surroundings. What immediately caught Thompson's attention wasn't the man's appearance, but something more subtle: his posture. The attendant stood with shoulders squared, feet positioned in a stance Thompson recognized from decades of military service. It was the unconscious bearing of a soldier, muscle memory that never truly fades even years after hanging up the uniform. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you today?" the attendant asked, his voice carrying a tone of respectful professionalism that seemed almost out of place in the casual desert setting. Thompson noticed the man's eyes, sharp, alert, constantly scanning. They were the eyes of someone trained to assess threats and opportunities, to read people and situations with the precision of a military tactician. "Need to fill up at pump 2, Thompson replied, pulling out his wallet. $40 should do it. As he handed over the cash, their fingers briefly touched, and Thompson felt the unmistakable calluses of hands that had known hard work and careful maintenance of equipment. But there was something else: a small, faded tattoo, partially visible beneath the man's rolled-up sleeve. Thompson caught only a glimpse, but his trained eye recognized the distinctive outline of an airborne wing insignia. The attendant counted the bills with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and precise. Everything about this man spoke of discipline and training, yet here he was working alone in a forgotten gas station in the middle of nowhere. Thompson found himself studying the details: the way the man's work shirt was pressed despite its age, how his name tag reading Pete was positioned exactly where military regulations would require it, the subtle confidence in his bearing that spoke of leadership experience. "You served?" Thompson asked casually, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. It was more statement than question. In his 35 years of military service, Thompson had developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize fellow veterans. This man practically radiated military training. Despite his civilian clothes and humble occupation, Pete's hands paused for just a fraction of a second as he processed the receipt. His eyes met Thompson's with a look that conveyed volumes: acknowledgement, wariness, and perhaps a hint of resignation. "A long time ago, sir," he replied quietly, his voice carrying undertones of experiences that couldn't be easily summarized. Different life, different world. The way he said it suggested chapters of his story that remained carefully guarded, memories filed away in the classified sections of his mind. Thompson sensed there was far more to this story than a simple acknowledgement of past service. The pieces didn't fit. This man's bearing, his obvious competence, his way of speaking suggested someone who had held significant responsibility, not just served in some minor capacity. Yet here he was, alone in this isolated outpost, content to remain anonymous while serving travelers who would never guess at his true background. Something had brought this clearly capable man to this quiet existence, and Thompson's instincts told him it was a story worth knowing. As Thompson walked back to his vehicle, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd encountered something significant. The brief exchange had revealed layers of complexity in the humble gas station attendant that demanded further investigation. Instead of immediately driving away, Thompson made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He returned to the store, ostensibly to purchase a cold drink, but really to learn more about the enigmatic man behind the counter. "Hot day for traveling," Thompson said, selecting a bottle of water from the small refrigerated case. Pete nodded, his demeanor remaining professionally friendly but guarded. Thompson decided to take a more direct approach. "I'm General Marcus Thompson, currently stationed at the Pentagon. I've been in service for over 3 decades, and I've learned to recognize quality soldiers. You've got the bearing of someone who carried significant responsibility." Pete's composure wavered almost imperceptibly. His eyes widened slightly, and Thompson caught a flash of something. Surprise, perhaps even a hint of old pride breaking through years of carefully constructed anonymity. "General Thompson," Pete said slowly, straightening unconsciously into an even more military posture. "I'm honored, sir. Though I'm just Pete Morrison now, pumping gas and keeping travelers safe on their journeys." But Thompson's trained instincts were screaming that there was much more to this story. The way Pete had said his name, the slight emphasis on now, suggested a deliberate transformation from something much greater. "Morrison," Thompson repeated thoughtfully. "That name sounds familiar. Were you perhaps in the Air Force?" It was an educated guess based on the partial tattoo he'd glimpsed earlier. The question hit its mark. Pete's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly, and Thompson saw a mixture of emotions cross his weathered face. Pride, pain, and something that looked remarkably like relief at finally being recognized. "Colonel Peter Morrison, retired," Pete said quietly, the words seeming to carry enormous weight. 28 years of service, most of it flying missions that officially never happened. Thompson felt his breath catch. Colonel Morrison, now the pieces were falling into place. He'd heard whispers of this man's legendary status among Air Force pilots. Morrison had been one of the most decorated fighter pilots of his generation, known for impossible missions behind enemy lines and an uncanny ability to bring his crew home against overwhelming odds. His exploits during Desert Storm had become the stuff of legend among military aviation circles. "The Ghost of Baghdad," Thompson said softly, using Morrison's legendary call sign. "You're the pilot who flew 17 consecutive night missions during Desert Storm, taking out strategic targets that conventional forces couldn't touch. The man who developed new stealth tactics that are still classified today." Thompson's voice carried genuine awe. He was standing face to face with a living legend, a man whose innovations had saved countless lives and changed the nature of aerial warfare. Morrison's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of his hidden identity had finally become too heavy to bear alone. "That was another lifetime, General. Another man, really. I left all that behind 15 years ago when I retired. Bought this station, settled into a quiet life. Sometimes the greatest service you can provide is knowing when to step away from the spotlight and let others carry the torch forward." The humility in Morrison's words struck Thompson deeply. Here was a man who had literally rewritten the book on combat aviation, whose tactics had influenced an entire generation of military strategy, and he was content to serve travelers with the same dedication he'd once brought to defending his country. It was both inspiring and heartbreaking. a reminder of the countless heroes who transition from extraordinary service to ordinary civilian life without fanfare or recognition. Thompson learned that Morrison had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier, and this isolated gas station had become his sanctuary, a place where he could serve others without the burden of his legendary reputation. The locals knew him simply as Pete, the reliable man who kept their vehicles running and always had time for a friendly conversation. They had no idea they were being served by one of the most decorated pilots in American military history. "But why here?" Thompson asked gently. "With your experience and reputation, you could have had any position in the defense industry, consulted for major corporations, written books about your experiences." Morrison smiled sadly, gesturing toward the empty desert stretching in all directions. "Sometimes, General, a man needs to find peace in the silence. After decades of engines roaring and radios crackling, there's something healing about the quiet desert and honest work. Every traveler who stops here gets home safely, gets to see their families. In its own way, it's still a mission worth flying." Thompson spent the next hour listening to Morrison's stories, each revelation adding another layer to his understanding of the man's extraordinary legacy. Morrison spoke of missions that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, of innovations born from necessity and courage, of the weight of responsibility for crew members whose lives depended on his split-second decisions. Yet he also spoke of the toll such service had taken, the sleepless nights, the friends lost, the constant pressure of operating at the edge of human capability. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Thompson realized he couldn't simply drive away and leave this encounter as just a memorable conversation. The military had protocols for recognition, systems designed to ensure that extraordinary service received appropriate acknowledgement. But sometimes, the most meaningful recognition came from personal initiative, from one warrior honoring another in ways that transcended official ceremonies. "Colonel Morrison," Thompson said, his voice carrying the formal tone of military authority, "I have a proposal for you. In 3 weeks, I'm speaking at the Air Force Academy graduation ceremony. These new officers need to understand what real leadership looks like, what it means to serve with distinction and humility. Would you consider joining me on that stage? Not as Pete the gas station attendant, but as Colonel Morrison, sharing your story with the next generation?" Morrison's reaction was immediate and emotional. His eyes filled with tears he'd apparently been holding back for years, and his voice cracked when he spoke. "General, I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of attention. I've spent so many years being just Pete, just a regular guy helping folks get where they need to go. The idea of standing in front of hundreds of cadets being introduced as some kind of hero." He trailed off, clearly overwhelmed by the possibility. Thompson placed a hand on Morrison's shoulder, feeling the tension of years of hidden identity. "Colonel, those cadets are about to enter a world where they'll face impossible decisions and overwhelming responsibility. They need to see that true heroism isn't about seeking glory. It's about doing what's right, serving with excellence, and knowing that sometimes the greatest courage is in choosing a quiet life of continued service. Your story isn't just about combat missions. It's about what comes after, about finding meaning in every chapter of life." Over the following days, Thompson worked behind the scenes to arrange something truly special. He contacted Morrison's former squadron members, many now retired but still carrying deep respect for their old commander. He reached out to Air Force historians who had documented Morrison's innovations. Most importantly, he convinced the Academy to create a new annual lecture series honoring veterans who had transitioned to civilian service while continuing to embody military values. The day of the ceremony arrived with perfect Colorado spring weather. Morrison, wearing a uniform that still fit him perfectly despite 15 years in civilian clothes, stood nervously backstage as Thompson prepared to introduce him. The auditorium was packed with cadets, their young faces eager and attentive, representing the future of American military leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thompson's voice rang out across the silent auditorium, "today you'll meet a man whose innovations in aerial combat saved countless lives, whose leadership under fire became the standard for excellence in military aviation. But more importantly, You'll meet a man who shows us that service doesn't end with retirement. It simply takes new forms. Colonel Peter Morrison has spent the last 15 years proving that every job, no matter how humble it might appear, can be a mission worth flying. When Morrison walked onto the stage, the standing ovation seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. 400 future officers rose as one, applauding not just his military achievements, but the quiet dignity with which he'd continued serving others. As Morrison began speaking, sharing stories of leadership sacrifice and finding purpose in every stage of life, Thompson realized this moment was about more than recognition. It was about connecting generations of warriors and honoring the truth that heroes walk among us in the most unexpected places. The gas station attendant who had left a 4-star general speechless had found his voice again, not as a legendary pilot, but as a living example that service, honor, and dedication transcend uniforms and official titles. In a world that too often overlooks quiet heroism, Colonel Morrison's story reminds us that the most profound courage often wears work clothes and serves with a smile, one traveler at a time. The next time you stop for gas, buy groceries, or encounter someone in a service role, remember Colonel Morrison's story. Behind that uniform, whether it's military dress blues or a simple work shirt, might stand someone whose courage and dedication have shaped our world in ways we'll never fully know. Veterans transition to civilian life carrying experiences and values that continue serving their communities long after their military service ends. These heroes deserve our recognition, our respect, and our gratitude, not just on Veterans Day or Memorial Day, but every single day. Their stories of quiet service and continued dedication remind us that heroism isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's as simple as helping a stranger get safely to their destination. If this story touched your heart and opened your eyes to the hidden heroes around us, please subscribe to honor more veterans whose incredible stories deserve to be told. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that extraordinary people often live ordinary-looking lives, and that service to others is the highest calling, whether in uniform or out. Together we can ensure that no hero's story goes untold and no act of service goes unrecognized.